Hey 207. I'm back to read another chapter of The Littles. Right now we're reading The Littles Take a Trip by John Peterson. This is our second Littles book, and we're getting about halfway through. So, if we think back to chapter 5, we read about the Littles, and they're all packing up to go on their trip to kind of hang out and meet with the other Littles families. So they're going to the Smalls house. Everybody's meeting there, so they had to pack up all their stuff. They're taking the cat with them, and they're going to head out. This is really crazy for the Littles because they never get to visit the other people, and they don't ever really go outside or travel anywhere very often. So this is very unusual for them. Cousin Dinky, who flies the plane, he's going to be flying over them to kind of watch and make sure everyone's good, because he does travel to all these houses a lot, so he's a little bit more familiar with the area. So we're going to read chapter 6 and see what happens next. So do you see that picture? It's a picture of them all heading out. So they have a cat, they have all their stuff, some of them are bringing their weapons with them. Some of them are a little bit more scared than the others that they're going to run into some troubles. Do you think they're going to get into any trouble on their trip? We'll have to see. The Littles started out. Mr. Little led the way. Lucy was next. She wore new hiking boots and carried her pepper shaker. Tom walked in front of the cat. He talked to her all the time. Mrs. Little and Granny Little rode on either side of the cat in the knitted baskets. Hildy, the cat, carried everyone's pack except Uncle Pete's. Uncle Pete was armed with a bow and arrow as well as his needle sword. He kept telling himself the trip was foolish, but if it was what his family wanted to do, he'd go along with it, and they just might need his help if there was any trouble. Hadn't he been an expert bowman during the terrible mouse invasion of 35? When the Littles were out of the house, Mr. Little held up his hand. "Stop, here, under this lilac bush," he said. "You, Tom, climb up the bush and see if the yard is clear to cross." Just as Tom reached to the top of the tall lilac bush, he heard a swoosh over his head. It was Cousin Dinky taking off in his glider from the Big's roof. Tom wanted to cheer, but he stopped himself. The Biggs might hear him. Instead, he waved wildly, shaking the top of the bush. Cousin Dinky didn't see Tom until he circled around and flew back over the house. He waved at Tom by dipping the glider wings. When he went over the trees and out of sight, Tom could see most of the yard from the lilac bush. None of the Biggs were near. It was Monday morning. Mrs. Big would be in the house doing her laundry. Mr. Big was at work. The Big to watch out was Henry. He might be anywhere around the house. So they leave their house and they're kind of in the yard. And so Tom's on this lilac bush. You can kind of see it. So here are some of the Littles down here. They're looking up, and then Tom, he climbed up the lilac bush, so he's up at the top. And he's looking, and he saw Cousin Dinky in the plane, and he's looking out at the yard to see if anybody's in the yard. So to see if Henry's out there, or any other people that might see them as they walk across the grass. Because remember, one of the most important things to the Littles is that they stay a secret. They do not want the Bigs to ever find out about them. And any minute, Henry and his friends might run through the yard like a herd of elephants. Whenever Henry and his friends stormed into the house, Mrs. Big would say, "Henry, I don't want anyone running in the house. If you must act like a herd of elephants, then do it in the yard. That is what the yard is for." Tom looked over the yard and decided the coast was clear. Cousin Dinky had told the Littles how to cross the yard. "Go from the lilac bush to the black walnut tree," he said. "Then go through the flower garden into the yard next door." Cousin Dinky told the Littles to go through the flower gardens whenever they could. He said people taught their pets to stay out of them. Why do you think it might be good to avoid the pets? Do you think maybe the pets, the dogs and the cats, might think that they're mice and good to eat? I hope Cousin Dinky knows what he's talking about, thought Tom Little. Tom was worried about the mean-looking dog next door. He hoped the dog had been taught to stay out of the flower garden. Tom couldn't see where the Smalls lived from the lilac bush. He knew where the house was, though, because he had seen it from the big rooftop. There was a woods between the two houses. Cousin Dinky had never been in the woods, and said it would probably be filled with wild animals. A good place to stay away from, he said. So Cousin Dinky had chosen a way that went around the woods. It was longer, he said, but safer, because it kept to the yards and the gardens. Tom took one more long look to make sure no one was in the yard. When he climbed down the lilac bush, he jumped into Hildy's neck. I didn't see anyone, he told his father. That's a long piece of yard to cross over, said Mr. Little. Cousin Dinky says it's the worst part of the trip. After this, the rest is easy, he says. Let's try to move extra fast until we get to the walnut tree, way at the back of the yard. Let's go, said Uncle Pete. Let's get this show on the road. Mr. Little raised his hand and signaled to his family to follow him. They moved out from under the lilac bush into the bright sunlight. The band of tiny people was halfway to the walnut tree when they heard yelling from the other side of the house. It was Henry Big and some of his friends. Good heavens, said Mr. Little. It sounds like they're coming this way. Henry Big's voice could be heard above the rest. I get to pitch, you guys. Aw, just because you have the best yard for playing baseball, said one of the boys. You think you can tell us what to do? The voices were growing louder. This is their ball field, said Tom. I've watched them play here 1,000 times. Mr. Little stopped in the middle of the yard. He looked to the right, and he looked to the left. I wish you told us that before, he said. Let Henry pitch, called another boy. He's got a good screwball. The boys came around the corner of the house. They were tossing a baseball back and forth as they ran into the yard. Everybody up on Hildy's back, said Mr. Little. He grabbed the loose skin of the cat and pulled himself up. Tom leaned down from Hildy's neck, took Lucy's hand, and pulled her up. Oh, dear, said Mrs. Little. Hold tight, Granny. Uncle Pete in his hurry grabbed Hildy's by the tail. Meow, Hildy started to silk back towards the woods. Uncle Pete finally got on her back. No, Hildy, no, said Tom. This way. He pushed and probed at the animal, turning her head by the way of pulling her ears gently. Suddenly, the baseball spun through the air, bounced, and hit the cat on the side. Meow. Hey, you dummy, yelled Henry Big. You hit my cat. That was the last thing the Littles heard as Hildy ran from the yard and into the woods. Here's our picture. So that's Henry. Him and his friends are playing baseball in the backyard right as the Littles were trying to cross the yard to get to the Smalls' house. And Henry and his friends throw the baseball and it hits the cat. So then the cat darts off and is running straight for the woods, which is exactly where they were not trying to go. Cousin Dinky told them that the woods might be dangerous because there might be some wild animals in the woods. So my question to you is, what do you think is going to happen next? What do you think is going to happen to the Littles in the woods? Are they going to run into any crazy animals? Are they going to get lost? Is everything going to be fine and they'll make their way through and they'll get to the Smalls' house, no problem? What do you think?